Okay, so what an incredibly exciting meeting. I get to speak on the same day as Kevin Telly Fong and a blooming astronaut. It's absolutely amazing. I'm an animal biologist, so I'm not a medic like most of you in this room. I study animal migration, and I use a range of miniaturized electronic tracking technologies to follow things like basking sharks and bluefin tuna, which is why I have quite a tanned face at the moment because I've been out on a boat a lot. But I also work on birds. I'm not a twitcher. I'm not very good at bird ID, so if anyone's seen anything on holiday they want identifying, don't come ask me, I'm crap at it. What I'm hoping to convince you by the end of this talk is that birds are pretty cool for a number of different reasons, not least they have no idea what Brexit is, so that's pretty cool. And they're very much international species, so they travel across borders, no passports or nothing, it's amazing. Anyway, birds hold an awful lot of the world records when it comes to animal migration. This bird is called a great snipe. This bird is capable of doing nearly 100 kilometres an hour and maintaining that for about 96 hours at a time. So it's pretty impressive stuff. A quick side story, a sniper, as in a military sniper, actually gets its name from this bird. When this bird is in its breeding grounds, it has a very erratic flight pattern, and only the finest marksman would have been able to shoot a snipe. So if you were a sniper, you were the finest shot there was, so that's where a sniper gets their name from. Most snipers don't even know that. This bird, the bar-tailed godwit, it weighs about 250 grams, but when it gets ready to migrate, it gets up to about 500 grams. It has the same fat content as clotted cream, and it uses this to do an 11,000 kilometre migration, which it does in just 7 days. We know from its flight speed it cannot be stopping to eat, to drink, and it probably isn't sleeping either. So this is a really spectacular animal. This is the Arctic tern, which holds the world record for the longest distance travelled by any migrant within the course of a year. They breed in the Arctic and they spend the boreal summer in Antarctica. So they make a planetary migration every single year. And these guys weigh about 100 grams, but they're 100 grams of pure fury. I'm currently studying these in Iceland, and they really hate everyone and everything. If you go in their nesting colony, they will just come down and attack you and your head's bleeding, and it's brilliant. I love an animal with a personality, and this one is probably the best of the lot. And then to get back to our session today, altitude. The world's highest altitude record is held by the bar-headed goose, which you wouldn't have necessarily thought would have been an altitudinal champion, but indeed it is. And these have been tracked by me, actually, up to 7,290 metres. And one of the main reasons that birds are capable of holding all of these world records is because they have enormous VO2 max. So if you have a look at some VO2 max values for some humans, and then have a look at some VO2 max values for some birds, they're massive, absolutely massive. So even a cruddy London pigeon has, a VO2 max that any athlete would be absolutely proud of. So one of the speakers in the seminar today was saying that elite athletes are not normal. In the bird world, elite performance is normal. It's amazing. They need to have huge VO2 max values because flight is actually very expensive. It's much more expensive, almost double the cost of running. But while it's very expensive per unit of time, it's actually very cheap per unit of distance. So if you want to travel over a long distance, you really want to be flying. Actually, you want to be swimming, but you've pretty much evolutionarily forked down that path. You're not going to suddenly turn yourself into a whale. So you pretty much want to be flying. And the reason that birds can manage these huge VO2 maxes is because of, as my title of my talk suggests, their unique cardiorespiratory system. So birds have a lung, as you might imagine, but their lung is actually quite small. It's about 27% smaller than a mammal of similar size. And the lung has an important role in oxygen extraction, as you might imagine, but it plays no role in mechanical ventilation, and birds completely lack a diaphragm. Instead, the bird is mechanically ventilated via a system of air sacs. And these air sacs, you can see here in white, go all the way through the bird's body, from the abdomen to the thorax. They even have some that extend up into the humerus and into the head. So they're incredibly full of air, essentially, if you like. The lung itself, as well as being small, is also deeply embedded within the bird's ribs. And this massively restricts its capacity to be elastic. So on ventilation, the bird lung only really increases in volume by about 1% to 2%. So you can essentially think of it as a fixed and rigid structure. But the air sacs take up a massive proportion of the bird's body. And this latex cast that you can see here, where the lung is here in this crenulated structure, you can see a massive amount of the rest of the bird is made up with these air sacs. And in the bottom left, you can see a mallard where the air sacs have been filled with a blue latex. And it's hard to imagine there's any space left for anything else. Fun fact, I had a house renovation done recently, and our builder said he was sat in Devon seaside town and he threw a chip in the road for a herring gull, and this herring gull swooped down to get it at the same time as a Land Rover came around the corner and ran it over, and he said it popped like a bag of crisps. He said it just went bang and there was just bird absolutely everywhere. But I showed him these slides to try to explain. So now he's a bird expert, so it's amazing. So it's really, I find it incredible how much air there really is inside of a bird. These air sacs are avascular, but they're actually really quite difficult to see inside of the bird. So either during surgery or post-mortem, they're very difficult to see. So there's just about 2 thoracic air sacs going on there. But if you should happen to come across a dead bird, have a look. They're pretty hard to find, but as I say, they're all the way through the bird's body. The point of this zany air sac system is that whereas we have this tidal biphasic ventilation system, birds instead have a unidirectionally ventilated lung. So if you have a look at the fresh oxygenated air coming into the chicken's mouth in yellow, you see it travels first to the back of the bird, and then it's actually travelling up towards the front of the chicken, and you see that some of that fresh air travels into the chicken's lung, but some of that fresh air is travelling into the abdominal air sacs. When the chicken then breathes out in pink, you can see the air in the lung is moving out of the chicken's trachea, but then the air in the air sacs is moving into the lung. So that every time a bird breathes in, fresh air travels across its lung, and every time it breathes out, fresh air travels across its lung. So they are at least twice as good at anyone, any mammal or human, at extracting oxygen from the environment. And this is true of any bird, even non-volant ones as well. So birds are caudocraniously, continuously and unidirectionally ventilated, which is basically pretty amazing, I think. Not just that, but the lung itself is intensely subdivided down into fine little parabronchi, which themselves are then subdivided down into air capillaries. And these air capillaries are about 10 times smaller than the alveolus in mammals. And the air capillaries themselves are then arranged at right angles to the blood capillaries within the pulmonary system. And this means that there's actually a cross-current gas exchange system set up, which is far more efficient than the kind of alveolar capillary system that's present in mammals. So, although the avian lung is quite small, if you add together the avian lung and the air sacs, you find that birds actually have a total respiratory volume about 3 to 5 times larger than a mammal of similar size, and about a 15% greater respiratory surface area. The blood-gas barrier is surprisingly thin. It's about 2/3 thinner than it would be in a comparative mammal. And that's possible not least because it's continuously inflated. It doesn't have to inflate and deflate all the time, so it kind of gets quite a lot of mechanical strength from the fact that it just remains inflated. And birds can hold about 1.5 times more blood within their pulmonary circulation as well. High-altitude pulmonary edema has never been recorded in a bird. We haven't deeply looked for it, admittedly, but because they have this unidirectional system of ventilation, it stands to reason that any fluid that could build up in the lung would be simply blown out the other end. So as far as we are aware, birds do not suffer from high-altitude pulmonary edemas. This is a little bit outside of my remit, but I knew others were speaking about cerebral oxygen, and so I thought I'd just mention quickly about some experiments that were carried out on some birds in the 80s, looking at cerebral oxygenation during hypoxia. And in this study, a duck and a goose were exposed to ever-decreasing levels of hypoxia, and it wasn't until about 5% oxygen that there was any change in cerebral blood flow. And this was done using radio-labelled microspheres. And one of the reasons I love coming to these meetings is because you guys have the coolest tools. What they did in this study is they basically injected the bird with radio-labelled microspheres, carried out the experiment, and then literally just chopped the bird up into bits and then just basically measured the radiation in all the different chunks to work out how much was in the brain flow. So I guess you guys don't do that so much, but we can, so it's great. Anyway, I don't do that. But oxygen content of the arterial blood was maintained throughout this. So all the way down to 5% oxygen, these birds are capable of maintaining cerebral oxygenation. So we suspect that birds are unlikely to suffer from high altitude cerebral edemas either, but this has also not really been well looked at and has never been reported. So all birds actually excel at altitude, but there are some species that do better than others. And as I mentioned, the bar-headed goose, which I have photoshopped onto this, it's not that you've just never spotted it before. If you just zoomed out a bit above Tenzing Norgay, there it was. But no, the bar-headed goose was actually, I've satellite tracked bar-headed geese flying up to 7,300 metres. But they were thought to have been seen by George Swan, a member of Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay's climbing party, above Everest in 1953. And so they've been subject of a huge amount of study. They're not the only species occurring at altitude. There's lots and lots of different birds. There's waterfowl, there's raptors, there's passerines, songbirds, and other birds that have been seen there as well. Most notably, I think there's a whooper swan. I mean, this is a big swan that's been seen at 8,000 metres by a pilot who presumably wasn't so addled by hypoxia that he wasn't capable of flying an aircraft. So I think we should probably believe that. And then a Ruppel's vulture, which was sucked into an aircraft engine a little over 11,000 metres. And these aircraft strikes are actually a really great empirical data set because they leave behind some evidence called SNARGE, which one can scrape off the propeller blades and use DNA molecular analysis to work out which species it came from. So these are, robust points of data for me. As of literally just yesterday, Matthew Wilkes over there and I just had a paper accepted with my PhD student comparing the abilities of birds against humans at high altitude. So very exciting. You're the first people I've told about this. But you can see that all of these species of birds are flying around at altitudes that cause significant issues for humans attempting to visit them. So this is quite impressive stuff. But as I mentioned, really, it's the bar-headed goose that's been the subject of a huge amount of study. So this very early study, which was carried out in the 70s, which probably cost about a tenner, they got a bar-headed goose, a Canada goose and a Pekin duck, shoved them in a box and basically pumped out the air to simulate hyperbarrier. And they scored the birds on how agitated they were, whether they could walk around steadily, stand up and hold their heads up. And you can see that because they're birds, and they're pretty amazing at altitude, they could start the experiment at 7,620 metres. 9,150, everyone's still basically okay. But by 10,668 metres, at this point, the Canada goose has now lost the ability to stand up and hold its head up. So it's basically kind of lying on the floor going, oh. So it's taken out of the experiment and they carry on with just the bar-headed goose and the Pekin duck. By this point, the Pekin duck's not looking great either, so it comes out of the experiment, but it carries on to a massive 12,190 metres. And although the bar-headed goose can't stand up very well, and it's got a plus for agitation, so, oh no, just one plus, so mildly irritated, it's still able to stand up and hold its head up. So, there was a good evidence to suggest that this bird may have something special about its physiological capabilities. So I decided to try to repeat this work, but using exercise as an analogue. Now, being a bird, you might have imagined I would have flown them in a wind tunnel, but they have a massive wingspan of about 1.5 metres, and there are not a lot of wind tunnels in the world that big, much less ones that want to be full of goose shit and feathers. So it's quite hard to find anywhere. So instead, I got a treadmill, and I put a Perspex box over the top of it, a little mirror in the front, and I got my little goosey chums to walk on the treadmill. So here they are doing a little 5-minute warm-up, and then we're going to go to running in just a second. Here we go. Oh, and we're running. There we go. So what the geese have to do is run as fast as they can for 15 minutes. And I then reduce the oxygen content of the box all the way down to about 7% oxygen. And this is a weird way to spend your time, but I spent a couple of years doing this in Birmingham. One of my best runners was called Usain Bolt. That's amazing. But what we found, genuinely was his name, but what we found is that these birds are actually able to maintain arterial oxygen content when they're exercising, even in only 7% oxygen. And they're able to do this via a massive increase in heart rate. So when a bar-headed goose is flying around, it would typically have a heart rate of about 350 beats a minute. During exercise in severe hypoxia, it can get its heart rate up to 500 beats a minute. We then repeated this experiment using a barnacle goose, which is a similar size, different species. It makes a similar distance migration, but it does it all at sea level. I put them in this experimental setup and they were absolutely rubbish. They could do about 30 seconds before they just collapsed on the floor, and I had to take the lid off and fan them and hope the Home Office vet didn't come in to see what happened. But some work by a colleague of mine, Graham Scott, who was at UBC at the time, actually looked at the cardiac capillary density for bar-headed geese and barnacle geese and discovered that bar-headed geese have about 25 to 35% more capillaries per unit of area in their hearts than barnacle geese do. And we think this is quite literally at the heart of their ability to be able to maintain these massive heart rates even in severe hypoxia, and therefore, of course, also to distribute the oxygenated blood to the locomotory muscles. Eventually, we did get hold of a wind tunnel at UBC as well. This is the mechanical engineering wind tunnel. And we flew the geese using a little Top Gun mask delivering a 7% oxygen gas mix to the birds. This was, running them on a treadmill was hard. Flying them in a wind tunnel was really hard. We had to imprint the birds on us first, and they did some crazy stuff, like we lost a couple during training flights and they would fly away and turn up in a supermarket somewhere and be hassling people, and they were kind of saying, we've got a really friendly goose here, and we were like, yeah, it's ours, we'll have it back. This work was actually led by Jessica Meir, who's now a NASA astronaut about to take off and go to space in just 2 weeks. So Jessica's going to be finally going higher than her study species, which is a pretty cool thing. These are the data from this experiment. So in squares, you can see resting values, in triangles, walking and running, and in circles, you're looking at flying values. So black is showing you normoxia, blue is showing you moderate hypoxia, about 10.5% oxygen, and red is showing you severe hypoxia. And what you basically see is that as the degree of hypoxia gets worse, the birds actually have a lower VO2 while they're flying. And our supposition is that this is likely to be due to downregulation of oxygen supply to any non-essential processes, so things like digestion or potentially thermoregulation. So if you're flying along at extreme altitude, where it's both very hypoxic but also quite cold, but you have less oxygen available to fund thermoregulation, then the next question is, do you actually start to suffer from hypothermia? So we actually implanted bar-headed geese with some loggers. I've brought one with me today, actually. So we have to make these ourselves. It's not easy in animal biology compared to what you guys have. It's amazing. But we surgically implant these in what I think you call a surgically austere environment. This is a yurt. The vet is currently standing in a hole we dig in the floor because the table's completely the wrong height. And she surgically implants these birds with these loggers, which record their heart rate, their body temperature, altitude, and 3-axis accelerometry. We then release the bird with the logger inside of it and a green neck collar on the outside of it. And then we have to head back a year later to Mongolia to look through all of the geese we can find in the countryside and hopefully see if we can find the literal needle in a haystack and get our logger back. And that's why I looked so ridiculously happy in that picture, because I really thought my academic career was over. We just had no data for like the first 2 years of the project. But this is what some of those data look like. So on the x-axis here, you can see body temperature, and you'll notice that birds have quite warm body temperatures, as Andrew mentioned yesterday. Typically around 40 degrees Celsius is quite normal for a bird. And on the y-axis is altitude, and we might have imagined that there might have been a reduction in temperature as you travel to higher and higher altitudes. But what you can see is there's not much going on really. Their body temperature is pretty stable across all of those different altitudinal bins. So there's really no particular relationship between body temperature and altitude. In other words, they're really good thermoregulators. A slightly different way to look at the data is via this clock plot. So here you're looking at midnight at the top. This is 6 a.m, midday, 6 p.m. And there's some circles in the middle here. And as the values move from the center of the circle to the outside, you're looking at body temperature getting warmer. So if you have a look at yellow to begin with, you can see this bird's body temperature is coolest at about midnight. And it's actually waking up at about 4 or 5 a.m. and its body temperature comes up. It remains up all day while the bird is active. And at about, I think it's about 8, 9 p.m. it goes to bed and its body temperature goes back down again. When it's migrating in purple, you can see the pattern looks completely different. So what's happening is that the bird is at its coolest at about 7 p.m, but then all through the night and during the coldest part of the day, it's actually making its migratory flight. So if thermoregulation is compromised by a lack of oxygen availability, then actually they can offset this with exercise thermogenesis instead. What's more, throughout the rest of the migration, we think there's other good reasons to travel at night as well. So the entire migration over the Tibetan Plateau looks like this. If we zoom in on probably the most exciting part of their migration, where they're in India at sea level and they have to make this massive climb up and onto the Tibetan Plateau, I'll show you that data in a slightly different way. Here you've got 7 birds, each shown as a different colour. And on the x-axis, you've got time of day, and on the y-axis, you've got altitude. So this is climbing from India onto the Tibetan Plateau. And you'll see, again, they're doing this basically overnight. They're doing this during that coldest part of the day. And also, if you're a bird, another thing that really matters is wind conditions. And we found that they're making these migrations overnight when they're probably experiencing relatively calm downslope katabatic winds. And they're probably avoiding migrating where possible in the afternoon stronger anabatic winds. And in fact, the turquoise bird there appears to land in the middle of those anabatic winds and waits out until the next day when the winds have slowed down again. And we think that by travelling at night, particularly during this crossing of the Himalayas, these geese are probably experiencing ambient temperatures that are possibly about 20 degrees C cooler. That means that the air is denser, and denser air means that you don't have to fly quite so fast to stay aloft, which of course then will save you energy, about 4% in this case, and increase the ambient PO2 around you as well. So I think there's a couple of really good reasons that these birds might be choosing to fly at night. So there's some behavioural as well as physiological adaptations that bar-headed geese have for coping with altitude, but I haven't actually told you about all of them because I could go on forever. But bar-headed geese do also have larger lungs. They also have a more efficient pattern of ventilation. So they increase total ventilation via an increase in tidal volume, not by respiratory frequency, thereby decreasing dead space ventilation contribution. They also have a greater capillarity of the flight muscle as well as the cardiac muscle. And the mitochondria have been relocated to a more subsarcolemmal location. So they've been moved closer to the edge of the muscle cell, closer to where the capillary supply is, thereby reducing the distance oxygen has to diffuse across to get into the muscle cell. And everybody always asks if they have a hemoglobin adaptation, and they do, and so they do have a lower P50 than other bird species that we've studied so far. But as I mentioned, they're by far not the only species that's making this migration. And so for the last 3 years, my PhD student has been working on this bird, the ruddy shelduck. There's a couple of reasons we're working on the ruddy shelduck. One is because one of our collaborators had some tracking data for them. And the second one is because I really want to publish a paper called "If It's Not the Bloody Geese, It's the Ruddy Shelduck." But I haven't managed it yet because none of the co-authors are keen on it. Would you accept a paper called that, Mike? Exactly, right? I know. Makes perfect sense. Anyway, the ruddy shelduck is a rusty-coloured smallish duck, and it makes the same migration from India and Myanmar up over the Himalayas onto the Tibetan plateau. And so my PhD student, Nicole, found that these birds are actually travelling up to 6,800 metres, so a pretty impressive altitude. And what's more, when they're making their migration up and over the Himalayan mountains, they're actually travelling vertically at about 2.7 kilometres of altitude an hour. So it's a massive rate of increase. And we think that's the greatest that's been reported for any animal to date. So they're actually quite impressive for a duck, but for any animal, really. So we discovered that they are going to altitude, and now we're starting to look at some of the physiological capacity that these ducks might have that might differentiate them from other ducks. So we've started by looking at the hearts, the lungs, and extracting flight muscle to try and look at things like capillarity. And we can stain and section the muscle to look for things like capillaries, and we haven't done mitochondria yet, but that's next on our list. And we've been comparing ruddy shelduck with a similar shelduck species, the European shelduck. You get these here in Britain, quite showy looking things. They have a lovely honk, have a lovely sort of quack. And they're of a similar size, and they're in the same genus, so they should be a pretty fair comparative species. We discovered that there is no difference in their relative heart mass, no difference in the relative lung mass. The capillarity of the flight and the cardiac muscle also doesn't differ in this species, between these two species, and there's no difference between their capillary to fibre ratios either. And that kind of surprised us because I did expect to find those adaptations because we know that they're present in bar-headed geese, but there's no evidence to suggest that those are present in ruddy shelduck. We then thought it would be sensible to look at their enzyme activities. And so we were looking at particularly enzymes related to the mitochondrial energy metabolism chain. And we found in particular that there appear to be some quite significant differences between two key enzymes relating to citrate synthase, C2 and C4. And we think that these may be related to differences in the functional properties of the mitochondria. We don't entirely understand exactly what's going on here, and this seems to be very different to anything that we've yet seen in bar-headed geese. But we suspect that there may not be differences necessarily in the acquisition of oxygen in ruddy shelduck, but more in how it's used within the cell. The other thing to mention is that ruddy shelduck are actually quite a lot smaller than bar-headed geese. So being much smaller, it's actually cheaper for them to fly overall. So it costs a ruddy shelduck much less to be in flight than it does a bar-headed goose. So it's possible that they actually don't need a lot of these hypoxia adaptations until they get to be a little bit larger. So my hunt across this list of species continues. I'm really looking forward to working on whooper swans, I hope quite soon. I found some suitable candidates in Mongolia that I'd like to get a grant to work on quite soon. But I hope that this talk has showed you that the next time you see a herring gull here in Portsmouth or a pigeon on the street, you'll suddenly look at it with new eyes and think, that's actually quite an amazing altitudinal champion. So all birds excel at altitude. And yes, there are some special ones, but all of them are pretty cool. Thank you very much.